podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam. This is All Across America. Don Schmitt, it's great to have you back on the show.
Good to be with you again, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So, I mean, you're a legend in the UFO space. You've been in doing research and studying this for the last 40 years, if not longer. You know, you've had your boots on the ground doing research, over 600 people in Roswell, New Mexico. That incident alone, you were the co-director of the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies, founder of the International UFO Museum in Roswell, New Mexico. And one of my favorite things about you is that you've approached these things from an analytical, scientific mind, and that you've said that when you first came to Roswell in the 1980s, you were skeptical. You thought it would be an in and out thing. And what happened once you got there?
Well, and my partner at that time, Kevin D. Randall, what was great was that he was of the same opinion, that it wasn't like we were going to play good cop, bad cop. Though that would be often the case. We'd be accused of being masters at that type of strategy in interviewing witnesses. But we were so sure we'd make a single weekend jaunt, down to the land of enchantment, as New Mexico is called, and quickly, wrap this up as being the balloon device that the government still maintains, or something just as prosaic. Yeah. And the first couple of days, it appeared to be the case. But we were only, at that time, trying to get leads on first-hand witnesses. And we were outside of Roswell. We were in Albuquerque. We went out to Corona, hoping that some of the old-timers would volunteer, information, running in the brick walls there. But it wasn't until we got into Roswell. And we would meet with people who were mentioned specifically in the newspaper accounts back in 1947. Like the public information officer, Walter Hott, and Judd Roberts, who was at the radio station, KGFL, who first broke the story, and a number of other witnesses, and specifically the very rancher, the foreman, W.W. Brazo, who reported the crash, reported this huge debris field of all that strange material. And it was his son, Bill, and his wife, Shirley, who we would meet in Carrizozo, a couple hours west of Roswell, and to listen to the civilian accounts just opposed to the military, describing the wreckage. And they were identical. And especially the focus on the memory material, that no matter the techniques that would be used by the rancher, with his buck knife, which would cut through sheet metal and tinfoil and wire fence, and then in the military, where they would talk about using a sledgehammer, or they would use a drill press and try to inflict any damage on this paper-thin, weightless material, and failing on all accounts. And we're realizing that, my God, no one is describing anything conventional. They certainly aren't describing anything of a balloon in composition. So we left immediately concluding that if we're wrong, we'll be the biggest fools in the history of mankind. Because to walk away from something that would pretend to be something as big, biggest story of the millennium. Yeah. Actual recovery, not just a fleeting glimpse of a sighting. Now you see it, now you don't, but something in hand. And all these witnesses, they're describing their impressions, their perception, but more importantly, how they felt, handling something that, from all accounts, was not made on this planet. And it didn't matter if it was the highest ranking military officer or a 7-year-old child back in 1947, now adult, but nonetheless, many years to reevaluate, re-examine, and then look at new technologies and go, that's what it was. That's what I held back. And they still would say, nope, have never seen anything like it before. and this is the impression I had back in '47, and this is the impression I still have today in 1989. It was not from this earth. Well, how more direct, how more profound is one, need as far as a direction in which to then pursue the evidentiary as far as wherever it takes us. And then that was the decision once we got back to Chicago at the Center for UFO Studies. In other words, we're going to take this wherever the evidence leads us. We are going to investigate every alternative possibility with the same relish, with the same enthusiasm, with the thought that, again, we'll let the evidence speak for itself. But to be honest with you, Mark, the overriding factor all these years has been the eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
That it is as though they are all reading from the same script. And that's impossible as far as that the military would be cooperating on any level with civilians. They just don't do that. And but there it is. I cannot give any other explanation. The fact that this was an extraordinary reaction to an extraordinary event. And a balloon does not suffice, nor is anything else conventional to date.
Talked about feelings, and I've often heard when interviewing subjects that a marker of truth is them talking about the emotions behind the recounting of an incident. Is
Yes.
that something that sticks out to you when you're interviewing that's a marker of truth? And are there other attributes, characteristics, movements that you've noticed in people that say, "All right, this person's telling the truth," or maybe
Mhm.
they're suspect?
Well, I'll use and not that we ever intended it to serve as bait or entrapment, but you mentioned the museum in Roswell. To date, we do not have an accurate portrayal of either the craft or the bodies anywhere in the museum. That will change now that the final witnesses have passed on. The first hands are all gone as far as we know.
Wow.
But the reason, quite simply, that we never coached them, led them, did anything to potentially contaminate them in any way was to provide them with our control information. Only they who were there and only us as investigators and the recipients of that information, as we've held on to that data, lest we influence anyone else. So, in other words, we did the Roswell movie, which premiered in 1994, the Showtime made for TV movie. And even then, we insisted that the portrayals, the depictions of the visitors would not be anywhere close to what the eyewitnesses described. Again, by design. We have one of the original props, one of those bodies, on as far as in a display. It's an autopsy display at the museum. We have preserved that latex covered foam dummy for all these years. It's still in perfect condition as we've maintained it. We were told originally by Stephen Johnson of FX, who did the special effects, that typically they last about 5 years. Well, we're going over 30.
All right.
But the point being, Mark, that whenever or if ever anyone described that body to us as a potential witness, we knew they weren't genuine. So, in other words, again, we didn't do that by intent as much as we wanted to make sure that the information was always as pristine and unaffected as possible. And so then, once they went into other directions, they had our attention, they had our interest. And then when they would display emotion, one of them in particular, for example, now that you mention it, was Private First Class Elazar Benavides. And he had just finished his guard duty assignment at the base. He had signed off for the day, and then he was told to report directly to the big hangar, as they called it. It was Hangar P3, Building 84. And he knew what had gone down. He knew that the base was on lockdown. He knew that there was outside personnel that came in, for a couple of days. They didn't recognize a lot of these GIs and a lot of the officers and a lot of the suits that all of a sudden showed up on the base. And so he's handed a carbine rifle and he's basically told, report inside immediately. We have a transport that needs to go to the base hospital. Now, mind you, his wife pled with us for 2 years, trying to get him to finally talk to us. And her explanation was he saw something so traumatic, so terrifying at the time, that they were not able to sleep in the same bedroom for 40 years, that he would bolt up in the middle of the night and just scream out for what he saw. And it took us 2 years to get him to finally talk to us. Meeting after meeting after meeting, and he would start crying, and he would just, "I can't, I can't, I can't."
Yeah.
And then when he finally, because we handled it as gingerly and respectfully, we never incorporate, any form of rough or harsh, "I need to know now," or "You only have so much longer to be with us, and I need it,
Right.
before it's too late." We were always confident that when he was ready, he would open up. And he was cupping his face. The tears are actually running between his fingers, and all at once he goes, "If you would have seen what eyes." And he described how there were gurneys inside the hangar, sheet draped, but it looked like the size of children. And that's what initially scared him. "Oh my God, something happened and there were children involved." We heard that type of comment from a number of other people, that upon first arrival or impression, "My God, these are children." Very indicative of the size, certainly. And then the phone calls about the child-sized caskets only fueled, the notion that we're talking about small bodies. And he describes how they are then ordered to load these up into the back of an ambulance truck, take them directly over to the base hospital. And one of the men stepped on the corner of the sheet by accident. And Benavides was the closest to the rear of the truck. So it was the upper part of the body that then became exposed, and he immediately is staring right in the face, 6 inches away. And it's not human. And then the eyes open. And he was floored. I mean, but they're still highly trained military people. He's assigned to the atomic bomb base. They're the first bomb squadron in the world. They all have a top security clearance, so they go through the motions. They do what they have to do. But if that wasn't enough, then also getting in that truck, in the rear of the truck, and escorting those bodies over to the hospital, and then unloading them and taking them inside. So it just continues, that level of anxiety as to, my God, what am I, experiencing right now, that I can't go to the Army manual and it tells me nothing, how to, behave in this type of a situation. So to hear him at the time, 50 years, 55 years actually, after all that, and to see him still become that emotional.
Was he able to describe the being?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. He referred to them as the new species, which is interesting, and that is what one of Dr. Colonel Randy Lovelace of the Lovelace Clinic up in Albuquerque, and they were experimenting in the aftermath of Trinity, of the atomic bomb, and they were doing a lot of research on soft tissue with animals who were along the jet stream, the fallout pattern, and that we spoke to one of his nurses thereafter, and he had been called down to Roswell at the time of all the talk about the capture of the flying saucer. And Lovelace would have been, an obvious choice with his background, not only as a medical doctor, but what he was already working on. And when he returned, according to her, he referred to it as a new species. So here's Benavides using that very same term, new species. And ashen gray, the large horse eyes, thin slit for a mouth, diminutive nose, ears, that type of thing. A silver gray, one-piece jumpsuit. He only saw it from the chest up. But still, I mean, that lasting impression that people often, this notion that the fading years, the fading memories. And I always hearken back like to those of us who were alive on November 22nd, 1963. And we know exactly where we were,
Mhm.
how the news broke. We can repeat exactly as it was told us, and then what our immediate reaction was. And we weren't in Dealey Plaza. We weren't there. We didn't witness it. And we will forever. I mean, it's etched in our very psyche. Because again, it was a profound event in our life. 9/11 will do the same thing. COVID for a lot of people. I mean, in other words, there are specific events. And I'm sorry, right there is the idea that, well, it's 70 years ago, 75 years ago. No, 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 because they relive it. It's like Betty Barney Hill, the Hill incident. When Betty told me on one occasion, she said, "It's the first thing I think of every morning when I get up, and it's the last thing I think of every night when I go to bed." And so,
And, the long-term memory versus short-term memory are very distinct, and, people may not remember what they ate for breakfast, but an incident like that, you're never gonna
you're
forget.
never gonna forget, and you're not gonna forget the detail. You're not gonna forget your impressions. I'll give you almost a rather opposite, a humorous, because it only involves the material, the metal-like material, and that was, Sally Tetralini. She was the daughter of one of the ranchers adjoining the J.B. Foster Ranch, where Brazo was the foreman,
Mm.
where the debris was all scattered. And it was Brazo's son, Bill, who drove over in his pickup truck. And, he's a married man, but he just thought, he was going to impress her with a piece of this memory material. And she describes to us how she's watching that Bill hold his hand out, and no matter how often he crunches that piece in his hand, and every time he would release his grasp, it would just flow even between his fingers, just smooth right out, right before their eyes. And she says to us, "My lasting impression was, my God, wouldn't it be wonderful if clothes would be made of the same material and I would never have to iron again?"
Not a bad thought.
So, but again, from her perspective. So again, but it creates a visual, a wonderful visual.
Yes, yes, yes.
And that's the other thing that I think, Mark, impressed both Kevin Randall and then since then Tom Carey and myself, that these people have always painted just wonderful images that we can actually recreate in our own minds. And in my case, I have 2 degrees in art. And so I've long been told, and even Dr. Hynek, my scientific director, used to emphasize that our best investigators have art backgrounds. I mean, lest we forget that throughout history, the greatest scientists also were the greatest artists, whether it was architecture, whether it was engineering, whether it was, just basic design, that we have a movie going in our head. We visualize every word we hear. And it's a tremendous advantage as an investigator because it also, if it doesn't fit the mosaic, if it's something totally contrary and I'm visualizing, you're claiming you were here, or you're claiming you were here as far as in regards to this, and yet I can't picture you being there because I've been there and you could not have been there because I know exactly the terrain, I know the environment, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Tremendous aid in also discerning whether it's confabulation, exaggeration, or just fabrication.
Yeah.
And I think it's another reason that give me 5 minutes and I normally can tell if you're telling me the truth or not.
Yeah.
But
You talk about the terrain and the environment and, folks, I think of this area of New Mexico as being a barren desert of which where the crash was. That may still be true to this day, but
it is
this was the most important area in the world for military defense in 1947.
I always joke about how, especially when I lecture on college campus, and specifically if the faculty is present, I will pose the question, where was the first atomic bomb detonated? And how often the learned faculty, well, of course, Japan. It's like, "Oh, how about in the middle of New Mexico, just north of the White Sands Proving Grounds in 1945?" And they seem surprised. And then you had ongoing atomic research at Los Alamos, and then you had all the testing of the captured German V-2 rockets after World War II, also at the White Sands Proving Grounds. And is it any wonder that Project Blue Book, which Hynek had consulted on for almost 20 years, that based on their own statistics, their data, there were more UFO sightings in New Mexico than anywhere else in the country at that time. It was as though someone else was very interested in our military potential.
Yeah.
And what better place? Ground zero.
And Roswell Army Airfield was the home of the 509th Bomb Group, which was the only atomic bomb group in the world at that time, which is just incredible to think about. It makes perfect sense that somebody from outside of, non-human intelligence would be interested in that area.
And you mentioned the 509th and the fact that it was a composite unit, meaning that they selected the best officers, best pilots, crews, doctors, nurses, all to be in that new squadron. For one reason, they had to be the best. They were dealing with the biggest secret in the world at that time, beyond the very Manhattan Project itself. They were extension of that. They were now, the vehicle, the deployment of that new super weapon. And the thought that those people, of all people, were unable to identify very off the shelf common material, neoprene rubber and foil and wooden stick, string, and tape, and that they would misidentify a balloon as a flying saucer. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm sorry. And that we are still being asked that as of today.
Yeah.
Just amazing.
And maybe you could walk us through the events of July 2nd, just to set the ground for the Roswell incident itself.
Well, you had all of this activity because it was that last week of June. You had the Kenneth Arnold sighting over Yakima, Washington, those 9 crescent-shaped craft that he described as saucers skipping across the water. And it was reported at the Oregonian by the name of Bill Bichette, who then coined that very term, flying saucer, not based on their shape, but their maneuverability. And that was on June 24th. There was a tremendous amount of sightings in the upper, as far as North Pacific, and then it quickly swept down through the Southwest and appeared to be focusing in New Mexico, as I mentioned a few moments ago. White Sands Proving Ground had just tracked on radar unknowns that seemed to be infiltrating sensitive areas around some of the test grounds. And then you had a severe lightning storm, which we confirmed through the Stallion Weather Network. Late evening, July 2nd, between 11 and 11:30, they came off the southern Capitan Mountains, which coincided with the ranchers we interviewed who described what sounded like an explosion between the thunderclaps. And so it's the next morning that the foreman of the J.B. Foster Ranch, W.W. Mac Brazel, in the company of a 7-year-old Timothy D. Proctor, the son of his nearest neighbors, Floyd and Loretta Proctor, came upon this huge debris field, wreckage. Typically, they would be out, looking for downed livestock because it's high desert. The lightning strikes the ground. And as a result, after such a storm, you check for cattle and sheep that then would have to be, disposed of. And so they don't find that, but they find all this wreckage that defies conventional explanation. None of the neighbors, other ranchers, hired hands, or even a state police officer we tracked down, Robert Scroggins. No one is able to identify this material. Brazel finishes his chores. He doesn't have a hired hand on the ranch at that time. Huge ranch, 75,000 acres, 700 head of cattle and sheep, and then all the horses. It's not till Sunday, the 6th, he makes the long trek into Roswell, which was about 75 miles. But he doesn't go to the military. He goes to the courthouse, and it's the sheriff, George Wilcox, who then would notify and speaks directly with the very head of intelligence, Major Jesse Marcel of the 509th Bomb Group. Marcel would retrieve a box of the wreckage brought in by Brazel, and then he reports directly to his boss, the very base commander, Colonel William Blanchard. Now, we see how it continues to escalate in importance by the minute. The sheriff, his deputies, they don't recognize this material. Marcel, the head of intelligence, he's never seen anything like this before, and it's important enough on a holiday weekend, 4th of July weekend, that he takes it to the attention of the base commander. And there as well, Blanchard, he would say later that at first they thought it had to be Russian because they had never seen anything like it before. But then he quickly realized it wasn't anyone's. So typically, base commander or a higher officer would he would dispatch a couple of enlisted men, a couple of grunts, go check it out. Report to me as soon as you get back to the base. Who does he send out? Major Marcel and the head of counterintelligence, Captain Sheridan Cabot, who would specialize in foreign technology. So again, the ante keeps going up. At this point, they continue to demonstrate they have no idea what this is, what this represents. They have not been placed on alert, standby. Nothing is missing. Nothing has been tested. And it's high desert. Mark, I can't tell you how often I have flown over that site in a small plane, or even from a helicopter where you lift and you circle over the area. One thing becomes abundantly clear the moment you are at some altitude. You can see for 50 miles, totally obscure. And the reason I keep emphasizing that is if it was anything of ours, now mind you, it's been out there since the late evening of July 2nd, and this is now July 6th. No one's looking for anything, which means if we're not looking for anything, it's not ours. Then it comes down to whose is it? And so by the time the two intel officers arrive at the ranch, it's dusk. It's too late. There is a large piece that the rancher had dragged 3 miles to the north to a livestock shed. They check that out with a Geiger counter. No radiation, which you would expect, anything coming through our radiation belt. So, which causes us then to consider the possibility, is this an atmospheric craft? Something that's launched from something else, like a mothership, that type of thing. It's a reconnaissance device. So the next morning, first thing that Marcel would say, They couldn't get over the vast amount of debris. It was just all over. It covered an area, as it turns out, 9/10 of a mile long, almost a mile.
Wow. Wow.
Some balloon.
Yeah.
And that clearly it was a mid-air explosion, that it caused it to rain debris. There was no point of impact. There wasn't a crater of any sort, and an impact crash would have just cast debris up into the air, and it would have been all within a radius of, you know depending on the impact. But nonetheless, this was a path like the shape like a fan that it fanned out for almost a mile in a southeast easterly direction.
And there were 2 sites. There was the debris field and crash site.
There was an impact site, which they were not aware of, because they had then focused the debris. They would load up 2 vehicles with the material. Cabot would be sent on ahead by Marcel because he had other plans. And you know the story, Mark. I mean, at 2 o'clock in the morning, he's waking up his wife, Beat, and his son, Jesse Jr., takes them out to the kitchen. And here he's got all this wreckage on the kitchen table and floor. According to Jesse Jr., even under hypnosis, all his father kept talking about was flying saucer, flying saucer. He never said anything else.
I mean, it's the coolest dad move ever. I'm a father of a 6 and 9-year-old, and I could just imagine showing them that sort of material and the, the hieroglyphic-like writing. They would be
And this
enthralled,
was
and they would never forget it.
no, and consistent with his father providing him with a sketch of Fat Man, as far as the atomic bomb,
Right.
and how that was gonna end the war. And then, but you can't tell anybody, son. Now, Jess Jr. is their only child. And you can't tell anybody, son, because you get your daddy in a lot of trouble. And he tore it all up, the sketch, and then he burnt it with his cigarette lighter. And true to his promise, Jesse never said a word till his father said, "Well, now that's all out. Go ahead." But the fact that his dad confided in him on the atomic bomb and the flying saucer. That's the bond that they have. It's a wonderful, beautiful thing, right up to the end, right up to the end. And I have a phone conversation that between the 2 of them at the end, and it's just beautiful. It's the perfect father-son, final call between them. And so, while they were gone, though, as you mentioned, Mark, they find the second site, and that was due to a team of archaeologists from Western Texas Tech under Professor William Curry Holden. And they stumbled upon that site, and there was a craft size of a Volkswagen Beetle, egg-shaped, seamless, damaged, and 2 bodies and 1 survivor. And they would also go to the courthouse. They would report this to the sheriff as well. That would be the reason then why the sheriff went out with a deputy, was actually his chief deputy, Tommy Thompson. And at the time, the courthouse adjoined the Roswell firehouse, the fire station. Same phone line went into both buildings. And so that is how the fire department also became involved. And that's where you have crew chief Dan Dwyer and another fireman by the name of Ed Reeves, who drove out in one of their personal cars and also to check out and witnessed the craft, the bodies, and the survivor. So you got the sheriff as a witness to the survivor, the 2 firemen, and the archaeological team. So is it any wonder then that becomes the much more crucial location? Because you're not just talking metal now or materials. You're talking about remains. And one's alive. One's alive. So it all came to a head that morning of July 8th, where it had already gotten out to the press. It was Frank Joyce at radio station KGFL who had spoken to the rancher, who they went up the day before, nabbed him, they grabbed him at the ranch, brought him back to Roswell. They hid him out at the radio station's owner, Walt Whitmore Sr.'s home, where they did a wire recording. And it's the next morning that they would kidnap, they would abduct Mac Brazel, the rancher, outside of the radio station, and they would keep him then at the base for the next 5 days, where they
And who is that? The army? The army?
the army, yeah, who has, again, no authority over civilians unless martial law be declared.
Right.
And the point being that talk about just total violation of his human rights,
Yeah.
no due process. They would not even allow him to call his wife nor his boss, that the ranch was unattended, that he was safe, as his wife is wondering what happened, what became of,
Oh, yeah.
his 2 sons and daughter. No one has any idea. And they put out that press release, though, at noon on Tuesday, July 8th, where they actually acknowledged they had captured a flying saucer.
Right, which is incredible. A lot of people don't realize that that initial story was based upon an official U.S. Army press release.
And the point being, Mark, they started it.
Right.
We the witnesses didn't.
Their story. It's
It's
their
their
story.
They claimed they captured a flying saucer. And if any skeptic, any scoffer, any debunker wants to go, "Well, you people are just exploiting all this. You just no, 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 no. Historic fact. At noon, Mountain Standard Time, Tuesday, July 8th, 1947, the first atomic bomb squadron in the world actually claimed they got one. It's that simple.
Yeah.
Now, it was all orchestrated, and it was all intended to not only divert attention away from the impact site with the bodies and the survivor much closer to town, where people were gonna have much greater access. And so it worked, all with the plan that they would then divert attention away from Roswell. They had the balloon press conference going up the chain of command with General Roger Ramey, who was Colonel Blanchard's boss, head of the 8th Air Force at Carswell Army Airfield in Fort Worth. And Marcel would tell the story how when they arrived in Fort Worth, and he's told there's going to be a press conference. And Major Marcel, in that press release that had just gone out 3 hours before, he's the only one mentioned. He's the only one named in the press release.
Yeah.
So he becomes target number 1,
The
source number
scapegoat.
1. Yeah. And so they arrive in Fort Worth, and he would place a box of wreckage on General Ramey's desk. The general then takes him to a map room to check out the location. And when they return, Marcel is shocked to see that the balloon has been now substituted for the actual material, that the box of wreckage is gone, and in its place is a clump of black, rotting neoprene rubber balloon and a shredded radar reflector kite, foil, sticks, string, and tape. There's a hallway of reporters waiting to see the piece of the flying saucer just arrived. And again, talk about a press conference, and General Ramey only allows 1 reporter into the room. Someone who they had worked with before on stories, someone they
Right.
trusted, someone who would get it their way. And
Yeah.
that was James B. Johnson of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram newspaper. And the rest is history. Marcel is ordered to pose with the balloon. He even has the dust on his shoes still from the actual debris field. And here's the curious thing, Mark, and I always point this out, especially to military people. Why is Marcel then first sworn to secrecy after it's all been explained away? Ladies and gentlemen, it's just a weather balloon. There's nothing more to see here. And I'm canceling the resumption of the flight, which was originally destined for Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, for testing and analysis. Well, why would we need to test and analyze a balloon? So
Right.
canceling, the flight. And so Marcel is immediately taken aside by Ramey, and he's told, "You're never to say another word about this. You are never, not even permitted to discuss this with your wife back in Roswell." And then Ramey's own chief of staff, Colonel Thomas DuBose, who we interviewed when he was a brigadier general, and he signed a sworn affidavit where he not only described that the balloon was a hoax, he not only described that they were the ones who switched the balloon for the real material,
Yeah.
but that Ramey also ordered him never to bring it up ever again. So they're sworn to secrecy after it's been explained away. What are they sworn to secrecy over? The truth. That's what it comes down to. You are never to utter the truth about what really happened ever again. You know, if I were presenting all this in a court of law, and much of this certainly is abbreviated, much of this would involve I could bring in multiple witnesses for many of the different aspects of all this. That wire recording that I mentioned that they did with Mac Brazel, and then that was confiscated from the media, from the radio station. Well, violation of First Amendment. And then when the FCC, and it was J. Slowey, who was the vice president, the, the Federal Communications Commission in Washington, calls up the radio station and threatens them with the loss of their license if they said one more word about the incident. Can you imagine that happening today? You know, you report a story, you tell a story, you tell the truth about something, you'll lose your license. Or we're going to confiscate, your interview with so and so, that type of thing. It all paints a picture. Whatever anyone wants to believe about Roswell, it certainly is a cover up. It's not a conspiracy. No one conspired to do this. This is the response to what historically actually took place. It's the aftermath that one could then argue was a conspiracy by the manner in which they handled it. But the fact that they have decided for all time that the public does not deserve to know the truth about this would make it to me, the biggest cover up of the story of the millennium.
Of course.
I think much of it also has to do with the culpability, the fact that they threatened, and worse, a lot of the people who were involved.
Yeah. And we talked about truth and some markers of those that are telling the truth and markers of those who are not, and one of which is sticking to your story. And the United States government has presented 4 different stories.
Sure.
We talked to 2 of them, which was, saying that it was a flying disc, then saying it was a balloon, and then there were a few reports that were released in the 1990s explaining it differently. What happened there?
Well, as we were working from 1993, we started working with the late Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico. And we would meet with him at his office in Washington. We'd meet at his home office in Albuquerque. He saw it mainly as an opportunity to represent a lot of his own constituents and even others in New Mexico who were not in his district. But nonetheless, it would be a smart, you know, project as far as any politician, because you're actually, looking into something that has a good number of voters angry and upset over the manner by which they were treated or something as mundane as a balloon. And all we're asking for is accountability. All we're asking for is an apology. And all we're asking for is the truth. What was it that I held in my hands back in 1947? And if it was a balloon, why did you threaten to kill me over it? And so all the material that we could provide the congressman with to spearhead an investigation, and he immediately saw that he was being stonewalled, not only by the Pentagon, by all the branches of the military, by all the departments of intelligence, but then the White House. And then he would send 3 separate letters to then Secretary of Defense Les Aspin. I need help on this. I'm being basically denied access as a senior congressman, and all I'm asking for is some, release of documentation. No matter what the final conclusion was, I'd like to then be able to present this to, the people of New Mexico, that this was the final conclusion of what happened back in 47. All 3 letters went unanswered. And so the congressman is realizing the cover-up continues, and now it's on the congressional front. At that point, he pushed openly for congressional hearings on Roswell. And if only we would have had the same atmosphere back then as we do today. There wasn't a single other person on Capitol Hill that was willing to risk, especially due to the taboo related to the very topic, in supporting him. He was a lone maverick that was championing, our efforts, and we could not be more proud of not only the fact that he stood up to a lot of scrutiny as far as his colleagues, but also the press. That they were laughing at him, they were jeering at him from the sidelines and thinking that just what a waste of a politician's efforts. And so, but they were still getting nervous because he was unrelenting, and we were not giving up. We were then promising we were going to present, given we would have eventually our day in court, our best evidence. And it was in September 1994, and it was Colonel Richard Weaver at the Pentagon. They had a press conference. And under all that pressure, they admitted they lied about the original Rowan weather target, that radar target balloon explanation. And they presented a new theory. And that's how they labeled it, a theory. Project Mogul, Russian spy balloon. Same balloon, same exact components, except an acoustic listening device, essentially a microphone. The theory was that if the Soviets were to detonate their own atomic bomb, which they wouldn't until August of 1949, that we would pick up the shock wave in the upper atmosphere. Project failed miserably, never worked. But nonetheless, they would attribute Roswell to flight number 4. Well, what they weren't counting on is that we were in the process of tracking down the flight log records. And we were then able to document that flight number 4 was scrubbed. It never took place. There was a heavy overcast. They jettisoned the helium-filled balloons, but the radar arrays were never, as far as suspended beneath the balloons, which in their eyes would account for that wreckage, that covered that at the debris field. So if you can't place it at the scene of the crime, it's disqualified. So we had an immediate press conference. So we responded to Colonel Weaver and said, sorry, you can't place a balloon. You can't place anything conventional there. I know this was your best effort. And sorry, Project Mogul officially disqualified, officially discredited, does not apply to the 1947 incident. What's amazing, Mark, is how many of my colleagues still, it was Mogul, for no other reason than I don't want Roswell to be true. I don't want Roswell because it ends it. It's the granddaddy. It's the one case that could solve this and end this all overnight.
Yeah.
I want to, stretch out that mystery, because as long as that mystery continues, I stay in business, so to speak. And so it's why colleagues, I say that disparagingly, that would only wish Roswell would go away, because it tends to suck all the air out of the room whenever the topic comes up. Because again, it just stands on its own. Nothing else comes close.
Yeah.
So they would then come out with another report the next year, and this one was 750 pages, where they tried to again demonstrate that it had to be Project Mogul. They didn't interview any witnesses. They never spoke to us. It was like, and even the person that they got to research this. Now, let me ask you this. Why would you enlist? We're at the Pentagon, and we enlist someone who's in the reserves and he's a captain, lowly captain, who has access to really nothing. And we want you to research this mogul balloon project and then write up this report, how this could then become applicable to 1947. How can we
I feel for these guys. I mean, they were set up to fail and did the best they could in the circumstances they were given.
precisely, Mark? And Colonel James McAndrew, Captain James McAndrew, he becomes the authority on Project Mogul for the sole reason that he knows nothing else. He has not been briefed. He is not privy to anything else. And so he cannot slip. He can't accidentally say the wrong thing. The only thing he can respond to is my research demonstrates that this was a balloon. That's how they do it. I mean, it's nothing, genius about that as much as it's the compartmentalization, need to know. And in McAndrew's case, he had absolutely no need to know the truth. Just come up with a counter explanation, nothing else. So we're approaching the 50th anniversary in 1997, and we had a growing number of firsthand witnesses to the bodies.
Yeah.
And that became, again, a major dilemma on the part of the Pentagon, because it's one thing to explain away wreckage, materials, but how do you explain away a new species, as we referred to it earlier? And so they came up with another press conference, Pentagon, at the end of May of 1997, just before the anniversary. And then they trotted out the anthropomorphic wooden crash dummies, Project High Dive and Project Excelsior.
The
Now,
time traveling crash test dummies.
exactly. We'll get into that in a moment. But I wanted to tie this in specifically with Dr./Colonel Randy Lovelace, because part of the project originated when they were initially testing for paratroopers from diving at high altitude, breathing apparatus. And it was Dr. Lovelace who essentially was the first diver, the first guinea pig to test this apparatus. And his glove tore off as he was descending. And he says he had severe frostbite on his hand as a result. So it was thereafter that they started using these crash test dummies. And they'd be 6 feet tall. They would be plastic and metal hinged, that they would be jointed as far as just like a human skeleton at all the appropriate places. They would be wearing a one-piece jumpsuit, boots, harness, and goggles, the breathing tanks, and a parachute. Now, I can tell all your listeners right now, we do not have a single account of any of the witnesses describing the bodies being parachuted,
Right.
wearing goggles, wearing helmets, and certainly not made of plastic
And being 6 feet tall.
and being 6 feet tall. This hasn't happened. Never happened. And then, as you mentioned, Mark, these projects did not originate till 1952, 5 years after Roswell. And they came up then as a result with this new medical malady that you will not find in a single medical journal or book, which, as you remember, is called time compression.
Mhm.
There's no such thing. The idea that as we get older, we not only start to confuse the years, but also the decades.
Mm.
Okay, so now we're confusing also the decades. Okay. Well, we quickly put out a press release where we pointed out specifically that of all of our witnesses to the bodies at that time, not a one of them resided in New Mexico in 1952.
Mm.
So again, you can't place them at the scene of any of these crash dummy test sites. So then we had a challenge from the New York Times, which was, if you can provide us with a single first-hand witness that checks out to non-human bodies, not only will we retract the present crash dummy test explanation, but we will also go back to 1947 and retract that original balloon explanation that came out on July 9th of 1947. Okay? Well, we didn't provide one. We provided eight.
Wow.
8 first-hand witnesses, both military and civilian. And we never heard from them again. So, but we carried out our part of the bargain, so to speak. And I guess, Mark, that's been the greatest satisfaction in all this through all these years, that after a while, you feel in many respects that all these witnesses become like extended family, in a sense that they're in their declining years, they only have so much time left. And they have fought the good fight. Many of them were in World War II. They certainly, and many of them were in the Korean War. And as a result, they fought the good fight. But this was something else. This was something that they couldn't share with their families, something that they had to live, a lie, a deception for a lifetime. And to have that gauntlet passed on to us, to have us entrusted with something that they then asked us to finish.
Yeah.
And we have done, and we are doing that. We see this as a mission that, as I speak out, even with the current state of affairs in Washington, and I will keep reminding them, where were you 30 years ago when we were pushing for congressional hearings? When we had 150 whistleblowers. We had, true firsthand whistleblowers who could say, I held it in my hands and it was not made on this earth. Or the eyes open and I saw that it was alive and it was not from here, that type of thing. Where were you? And that's why I will certainly still cooperate. If I'm called to testify, if I'm, asked, which has not yet happened, Mark. Don, where do you think the bodies are today? Or can you help direct us to where the wreckage is today? Yeah, I can do that. I certainly can. And I can point to specific first-hand witnesses who have informed us that, yeah, we still have it. We're still trying to find the on button, so to speak. We have 3 full-bird colonels that have told us exactly where at least a number of the bodies are being preserved today. Okay? But it's like what I mentioned to one of the Congress people just a few weeks ago. You remind me of the person who I'm buying a house online, and I'm just asking you to send me pictures. I'm willing to buy it sight unseen, and all you people keep asking for are pictures. All you keep asking for are files, documents, videos. You're dancing around this. I don't get it. You're playing games with all of us. Because if I'm you, I'm going, you got 24 hours, I want a piece of wreckage on my desk.
Right.
Why won't you go there? Oh, we don't wanna lose them. We realize we gotta do this in baby steps. We're all big boys here. We're all adults. Baby steps? It's 80 years. I think that ended 75 years ago. So again, excuse me if I sound a little annoyed at times, but it's like we're dealing with a room full of amateurs again. They know nothing of the history. They really know nothing of this. You got Burchett now. As much as I admire him, he's got his own theories on Roswell. Based on what? I mean, Congress, what do you base that on? You won't come to, I've invited you to come to Roswell. half a dozen times. We'll take
Alright.
you out to the debriefing. We'll take you out to the crash site. I'll fill up a room at the museum with 50 family members that can tell you firsthand what it was like to live under that cloud of fear and intimidation. And yet you have a theory. And as Dr. Heine would talk about, theories come a dime a dozen. They're worth nothing.
Mm. Easy to make, hard to prove.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so you mentioned the craft and bodies and knowing the location. Where are they, do you think?
I won't be giving anything away by saying that we have high-ranking officials that have stated Dugway, the Biological Medical Research Facility in Utah, which is also known as Area 52, of all things. And we have had now firsthand witnesses from Boeing, from Lockheed Martin, from Battelle, from Los Alamos, from Rand, from Bell, from General Electric, all talking about attempts to reverse engineer materials. Biggest problem with that, Mark, is you cannot submit a FOIA, a Freedom of Information, to any of these defense contractors. They cannot be subpoenaed.
So private entities.
They're private, yeah. And so what I just witnessed once again by being down in Dayton and speaking to officers there who I know well, wouldn't it be the ultimate irony that, and I would hear this, Kevin Randall and I used to hear this early on in the investigation, and we made a trip together to the Pentagon, where we met with then Colonel Richard Mitchell, who was head of Army intelligence, as he was helping us, actually locate Army intelligence. You know, we talked earlier about the Project Mogul press conference, and it was the Secretary of the Air Force at that time, Sheila Winnow, who announced that she was hereby absolving all Air Force personnel of their security oaths regarding Roswell. They were free to speak, free to talk out. Well, not a single reporter picked up on the fact that there was no Air Force back in July of 1947. This was an Army incident. How does the Air Force absolve Army
Mm.
officials of a security oath? Impossible. So it's a red herring. And so the same problem, I think, as we learned when we were at the Pentagon and thereafter, that the new order is actually more than a bit unnerved over the fact that UFOs withstanding that a lot of very sensitive topics in general, that they have been precluded. They have not, the old order has not passed things down to the new order. And UFOs possibly being at the tip of that spear. And that so many of the officers took it with them and shared with anyone. And you have a situation today, and I think it's one of the factors that I believe that the Pentagon is presently dealing with is that they don't know where to look. They have been denied themselves, and that because everything would have been assimilated into the private sector with the hope that someone would be able to weaponize, make this into something, of an advanced weapon, so to speak. And as a result, we'd show you, but we don't know where it is either. I mean, that's, to me, that is a strong possibility. And so that's why I see the possibility of disclosure with a small d.
Okay. And what does that mean?
Well, in other words, a soft disclosure. That I think the greatest thing that has been accomplished thus far is that they've removed the taboo. That it's something we can now discuss at the water cooler, at the
Yes.
coffee, dispenser, that type of thing. 20 years ago, that certainly was not the case. Now we can freely talk about whatever we believe or whatever our position. We can even talk about our experiences, and there's no reason to be ridiculed or laughed at. I mean, it should not affect, tenure as far as within a college, you know,
Right.
emeritus position, that type of thing. It certainly should be a career breaker, as has,
Yes.
so often happened in the past.
Yeah.
So that to me is next to disclosure, just a tremendous, tremendous breakthrough.
It's important to hear that, and I hadn't
Um,
heard that I hadn't heard it articulated in quite that way.
and so I see that opening up doors. And for those of us who are researchers and investigators, that it would be foolhardy on our part not. I was talking to Attorney Danny Sheehan the other day. And again, I said we may never have this opportunity again because they'll just move on to the next news cycle, and this will just get buried as though coulda, woulda, shoulda. It's now incumbent on us and to keep the full court press on, take it as far as we can, and then even if we fail, at least we gave it our best shot. I can't do it with firsthand Roswell whistleblowers any longer. It'd be forever, you know, a tragedy on our part. But for what we've accumulated, all those sworn affidavits, all those video depositions, and presently, Mark, we are up to 31 deathbed confessions.
Wow.
31, each one of them admissible in the court of law, each one, and down to a man, woman, and child. It happened.
Yeah.
No deviation, not the slightest question. And it's like I've had, again, skeptics. Well, you can't believe the Roswell deathbeds. Well, then we have to throw out every deathbed.
Right.
Come on. You can't be serious making such a foolhardy argument. And it's not like it's just one. We now have 31. 31. And so we are now pressing, we're searching out a lot of the families whose fathers, whose grandfathers, and so on we missed. But now with the hope that they say something while they still had time. And it's not every time the case, but every time we do learn of a new one, and they may even give a specific detail. I was in the OR, I was in the operating room, or I was, in the hangar, or I was on the flight, and this is what I saw. And it's not what I heard. The deathbeds are what they saw, what they experienced, and it it keeps me going. It keeps me getting up every morning, still thinking there's uncharted, territory that we need to explore. And I want to assure again all your listeners that when they're ready to hear from us in Washington, if you think the last hour and a half was a story that needs to be heard, wait till I really tell them the true story. Not that this wasn't, but I mean where they need to start looking, who they need to start subpoenaing, who they need to start getting to testify. And then let's get this solved once and for all, because none of us are getting younger. And as I said to Danny Sheehan, we may not have this chance again.
Yeah. So if disclosure happens, and I'm sure you've thought about this, what does it mean for humanity?
I would often use the argument, given back in 1947, it was just 9 years after the Orson Welles War of the Worlds broadcast. So very fresh in their minds at that time. Now, as it turns out, much of that was instigated by the newspaper industry that the upstarts, and radio broadcasting, journalists, that they were trying to paint them as being, reckless and unjournalistic by creating, such a scenario that people would think we were being invaded by Martians, that type of thing. So much of that was, concocted, that there wasn't all this panic that we've been led to believe all these years. But nonetheless, the people who were involved in 47 there was no panic of any notable consequences. These people, they lived out their lives, they raised their families, they worked their jobs, they kept going to church. None of that changed.
Yeah.
And this was unprecedented. Nothing like this that they could in any way relate to or look for answers. I mean, they were going to their parish priests, and just trying to be sure that it wasn't something black, something, evil in their eyes, that type of thing. And I had a psychologist just a few weeks ago. She said to me, Don, I think we have to be careful because maybe we haven't matured as much as we'd like to believe. And we were discussing that, yeah, we've grown up in the space race, the space age, and Star Wars and Star Trek, and, you know, E.T. and Close Encounter and all this. And so we've all been conditioned. But we've also been more pigeonholed in the sense that we have become even more dependent. Government services, social services, more people live in the cities than ever before. More people rely outside means for their very survival. And as a result, she said, let's look at what happened with COVID and the immediate reaction on the part of the public, and then even more so on public officials. We go back and look at that, and then she said, would you say we're ready if that's how we react to just, something that humanity has dealt with for centuries? It's just that maybe it was, our turn back in 2020 and it was the latest one, on the charts, that type of thing. And yet we all, not all, but many people reacted as though it was the first time. And so it caused me to pause and think, maybe they are smarter than we give them credit for. Maybe they do realize that the culture shock alone. And I don't believe that it would affect organized religion as, when they put out that, false notion. There was the Alexander study that happened around 1990, where they polled all the major religious leaders around the world, and they found that 87% had absolutely no problem with the consideration of life on other planets. In fact, the Catholic Church has been, I always joke about our library down at the museum in Roswell. We're the second largest. And I throw out the question, who would you believe has the largest? Nobody ever, but it's the Vatican. And then I joked they had a few centuries head start on us.
Very true.
So that to me, that's not a concern. But culturally, societally, will it crash? Will we go into a Great Depression, globally? Will it impact as far as the fossil fuel industry, to the point that, gas is going to spike at $10 a gallon? Who can predict? Because again, we've never been here before. And I don't know that the book has been written. I don't know that people know what's going to be on the other side of this ocean. And as a result, is it still going to be better to wait and see when the next worldwide calamity takes place? Let's see if we step up to it a little more soundly than we just did 6 years ago,
Mm.
where a lot of people did overreact. Store shelves were empty. I love all the pictures of all the shopping carts just overflowing with
Toilet paper, right, right.
uh, I mean, come on.
What do you think the phenomenon is? And I think that's one of the things, if disclosure were to happen, this understanding that nobody understands everything, that this may not be as simple as flying saucers from outer space.
Very good point, Mark. That what if we are dealing with something that isn't nuts and bolts all the time? What if we're dealing with something that, as Arthur C. Clarke suggested, that it would border on magic? That then we're talking, and I fully accept Dr. Hynek, we used to discuss the possibility of interdimensional
Mhm.
beings. He often would argue that if we'd have one or two good sightings globally a year, it would be much more suggestive of something traveling vast distances of space. But the fact that we're having sightings every day, here in and here, it's like they've arrived, they're here. Either they set up a base of operation, I know it's been suggested, like, at the bottom of the ocean, up at the Antarctic, that type of thing, or even on the dark side of the moon. I mean, all types of possibilities. They certainly would set up shop, at some point, but, you know, traveling from point A to B constantly. But then is it something that slips within our third dimension? It materializes, it becomes just as nuts and bolts as, the plane up at the EA, Oshkosh, air show, that type of thing? Or is it border more on the supernatural?
Yeah.
Is it spiritual? And then when they start throwing, are we talking angels? Are we talking demons? That type of thing. I personally, I don't want to go there because then everyone's going to be free to come up with. It's almost like everyone's perspection or everyone's interpretation of the Bible.
Right.
And as a result, it will I think it will drive the solutions, the answers even further away. That then it's gonna be nothing but opinion. And I still wanna kick those tires across the street.
Yeah. I mean, I just feel like disclosure would beget more questions than answers. Many more.
And how would this be something you could replicate in a lab? How would this be something that you could reverse engineer? How could, you ever come up with anything definitive that you could say, "This is the answer"? And I think it's enough, Mark, that when you just talk about if the technology is that advanced in itself, it's not like Will Smith in Independence Day jumping in the cockpit, and he's able to fly that thing like he's done it 100 times before. If you can't bridge the technology, that in itself, I think, is enough of a goal on the part of, science that at some point, again, trial and error, incrementally, we'll get there and we'll be able to plug it in and it'll work. But nonetheless, it's still something attainable, something achievable. In any other category, we would never get a handle on it. No,
Yeah.
no.
And you've been researching this, as we were saying, over 40 years. You've seen a lot of teases of, information and it's coming. What I mean, do you feel that something's going to happen in the next year or even couple of years? I mean, we've had 4 tranches of release by the Department of War now.
Right.
Momentum's picking up, though. What do you think's gonna happen?
As I said earlier, the pressure has to be maintained that if we drop this right now, we'll never have this chance again.
Yeah.
I appreciate and for the life of me, wish that Congressman Schiff would have had such a team that could, you know, continue, a team effort in maintaining the pressure, and specifically on the Pentagon for disclosure.
He
He never
sadly passed away.
Yeah, he never had that, and he died, rather mysteriously at the age of 51. I'll never forget when after the Project Mogul press conference, and I thought, well, that would be the end of our relationship. And he called me back from his office in Washington, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Don," and excuse my language, I'll just quote him, "Don, they're a bunch of goddamn liars, and I need to get reelected, and then we're gonna hit them twice as hard." He got reelected, and within 6 months, that rapid skin cancer from behind
Oh my
ear and then through the front of his throat, age of 51.
wow.
So we'll never know.
Yeah.
should that happen today, there is a full team. There are others, so they can't take them all out.
Right.
So it's much smarter today.
Good.
But they need to educate themselves further. They need to go beyond, well, we were just briefed on classified information, and if you saw what we saw, you wouldn't sleep for that. Well, stop waving that carrot. Stop teasing us. Well, I know something you don't know. But again, what are you going to do about it? What are you doing about it? Don't just keep telling us what you know or you think you know. And then do you even know it's the truth? Or is it just to placate, just to pacify and hope that it's enough to go away? What I didn't appreciate was Congresswoman Luna, I believe just about a month ago when she already said, I think this is about as good as we're going to get. Well, you're setting your sights pretty low. Then you're also demonstrating once again that you don't grasp what's at hand, what the history is, and what, the very future of humankind may indeed be at stake here. Because if
Yeah.
we don't realize that we're all on the same spaceship Earth together with a limited supply of resources and fuel and technology that will hopefully usher us into the 22nd and 23rd century, we're going to continue to digress. That AI will see us ripe for the picking, so to speak, and we'll become nothing more than extensions of our own machines. We need to once again step up and take charge. And part of that is, and as I even said to Burchett some months ago, UFOs withstanding, what you all need to be just furious about is that you have been deceived. Or
Yes.
anything. The idea that the Pentagon has not just been holding back, but that they have been lying to you, and you should not be taking that lightly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Don, it's been a great conversation, and I do hope that our representatives and our representative democracy are able to do their job as best as their abilities. And that's why this subject is so fascinating to me, is that people in very high positions of both the United States House of Representatives and Senate take this very seriously, and I think they take their role as our representatives very seriously. And when things are being withheld illegally from the legislative branch, we should all be taking it very seriously, and I hope we do get to the bottom of this. Don, so
Well,
what's next for you, and how can people find out more about you?
we have a website, Roswell slash or Roswell-investigator.com. I'm on Facebook at Donald Raymond Schmitt, which is strictly a UFO Facebook page. And I will be continuing lectures as far as I have even Finland and
Wow,
Milan in Italy in the fall, and Sedona, and another research trip to New Mexico. And we are seriously planning archaeological dig, which would be our sixth at the
nice,
field. And the next time going in with subterranean radar drones so we can
very cool.
cover a much more extensive area. So the hunt continues.
The research continues. That's great to hear. And, folks, please tune in to, read all of Don's books and research and study. And it's great to hear that you're still at it in 2026. And we need people like you, and we need people like our listeners to make this an issue with their own representative if they live here in the United States. But
Great.
Don, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thanks for coming back on the show.
I look forward to the next time, Mark. Thank
All
you.
right, let's do it.
Absolutely. Guaranteed.
All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.